Last week in the Adequate Water series, we explored the fence line on the eastern side of Pierce Point Road, featuring 2 elk corpses, at least one of which had clearly died because of the fence. This episode explores the fence line on the west side of Pierce Point Road. And if you thought the last episode was disturbing, well, buckle up. I also asked viewers to try and figure out what they were seeing in this footage. Indeed, it's pretty confusing, and that's because it doesn't make any sense. But not much does in Point Reyes these days. Maybe it's easiest to try and explain this by starting with a map. Alright, this is Pierce Point Road in the National Seashore, and this black line is the Elk Fence, the barrier between the ranch land and the elk reserve. You can see the border very clearly where there is death and where there is biodiversity. This side, the eastern side, is where Matt and I found the corpses of 2 elk right on the fence line. Now, when I say the western side, I'm referring to this elk fence. And when I asked you to explain what you were seeing in that footage, Matt and I were walking along here, and many of you guessed correctly that this was ranch land, indicated by how ugly and void of biodiversity it was. But you also noticed that this area wasn't looking particularly good. But most of you didn't mention that you could see a fence back here as well, or how good this looked. That's worth stopping really quick to give you another perspective. This is me standing within the elk reserve looking back out toward the ranch land. Basically, that's coyote brush in the foreground, and in the background is the product of an extractive, outdated industry. So let's explain that a little bit further. As you move away from this red line, down here, you see the land gradually starts looking a little better, a little more biodiverse, especially at this black line where things dramatically change. So what's going on there? How do you explain that? It is true for those of you who guessed that this was once ranch land that is slowly starting to recover. As bad as it looked, it didn't look as bad as this. But, and I don't blame you for not understanding this because, like I said, it doesn't make any sense. What is this fence doing here if this is a fence? If I zoom out, you can see that this fence line, marked in red, goes all the way around and comes over to the cliff where it's simply too steep to continue to have a fence line. But you also see that this black line does the same thing on a different route. And you have a very dramatic representation of the lack of biodiversity, the line between heaven and hell, death and life, where ranching takes place in the seashore and where there is biodiverse habitat. Let me switch views and I'll show you what that looks like in real life. This is my camera looking south and panning across the horizon, and this is all the new fence that we're looking at, and it just goes on and on. I'm going to go ahead and speed up the footage and get all the way across here and all the way to the cliffs. So, now you know what it looks like in real life. So the red line is what we're calling the new elk border. They changed the border because this area in here was simply too hard to get to. It was built right in the thick of some coyote brush, and it gets a little bit steep in here. The steepness and the difficulty of accessing partly explains why this, even though it was previously not in the reserve, still looks pretty good because it was just not possible for the ranchers or their cattle to get in there and destroy it. And what you have here with this yellow line is rancher barbed wire that was abandoned. Yes, it is still there, and you'll see that soon. And when the new elk fence was built, no one bothered to remove it. But what's really going to boggle your mind is that no one removed this fence either. So while a new fence was built because it was easier to maintain on this type of land versus in this thick, steep land, they just left the old one. So what might have been a positive for the elk getting a little extra land resulted in a barrier that just remained. And worse still is that it being unmaintained has allowed it to become a hazard. Not just a barrier, but an actual hazard. So right here is where Matt and I will start our tour showing you what we found. But first, for those of you who find what I just said to be unbelievable, rightfully so, I'll show you what I filmed on a different day. I was actually over here in the elk reserve and I filmed back this direction. So in my footage you can actually see the old fence and the new fence on the same horizon. Indeed, there's some elk huddled up against the fence, walking along it, trying to figure it out, trying to figure out how to get out, how to range in the natural manner that they would if they weren't in a zoo in a national park that only exists because of private profit industries that have no place there. And indeed, there you have a rancher chopping up the soil, getting it ready for the reseeding process of more non-native invasive agricultural plants that are grown there only for the sake of an industry that modern humans should have abandoned a long time ago. Now bear with me as I pan back across. Let me zoom in. You should watch this on a big screen, but there's an elk just sitting at the fence line watching what the rancher's doing or just wondering how to get out. And right there we have two more elk at the fence line. You see the difference in the landscape, I imagine. And this is the new fence, by the way. That's why you can see ranch work just on the other side of it. And now we panned back over and you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, another 7 elk. Just having their natural instincts of ranging completely crapped on by the existence of a fence that exists for one reason and one reason only: the continued use of public land in a national park by private profit ranching. Okay, let me pan down from those elk and that fence, the new fence, and we get down into this thick coyote brush and kind of some steep terrain. And oh, what's that? Another fence. That's the old fence. It is a fence behind a fence. It is a barrier inside of the elk reserve. Okay, let's start the tour of this maze of fencing.